Lesson 10 and 11, Distributive Property of Decimals and Fraction Multiplication, and the Product of Decimals. Goal: use arrays and partial products to apply the distributive property to find the product of decimals. Use estimation and place value to determine the placement of the decimal point in products, and determine that the size of the product is relative to each other. To start off the notes, we're going to go ahead and just calculate the product of these two examples here. When I'm multiplying with numbers that end in 0 or multiple zeros, what you can do, I usually write that number at the bottom, and really what you want to do is line up the number of digits, not the decimal point here. A lot of times people try to add a decimal point and add a 0. Please do not do that. Just go ahead and line up the digits and ignore the decimal point temporarily. So when I have two zeros here, instead of multiplying by 326 by 0 and putting 3 zeros, putting a placeholder, and multiplying 0 by 326 and putting another row of zeros, I'm just going to add 2 zeros here. Saves a lot of space. Now I'm going to multiply 200, so I have my zeros already in place. 2 by 6 is 12. 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5. And 2 times 3 is 6. Now, because it has a decimal place, I'm going to go ahead and count how many numbers after the decimal there are. And there's just 1. So there will be just 1 in our answer. And so the decimal goes right in front of that last 0 here. So 1 decimal place over, 1 decimal place over. So this answer is 6,520. For this problem, I'm going to do it very similar. 22 and 12 hundredths times 500. Because there's 2 zeros again, there's going to be 2 zeros below. And then I'm going to multiply 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times 1 is 5, plus 1 is 6. 5 times 2 is 10, carry the 1. 5 times 2 is 10, plus 1 is 11. Now on this one, I have 2 numbers after the decimal. So that means I will need 2 numbers after the decimal. That would make my answer 11,060. Introduction to partial products. Use partial products and distributive property to calculate the product. So the distributive property, you can kind of see an example up here, which any letter that we substitute in for A would be in for A. Same thing with B and C. So this A on the outside of the parentheses gets distributed to both of the values inside the parentheses. That's why it's called the distributive property, because you're distributing that value and multiplying it by both those numbers inside. So A times B plus A times C. So I'm going to show you how to do the same problems from above, but with the distributive property. And it's really helpful if you want to do mental math to separate numbers. It can be numbers with decimals, but it could also be numbers like 25. You could separate it to 20 and then separate it to 5, because together 20 and a 5 make 25. So I'm going to go ahead and show this one here. We're going to separate the 32 and the 6/10 from each other. This I can do in my head by writing down the 2 zeros from here, and then doubling 32 or multiplying it by 2, which is 64. So that would be 6,400 there. And for this one, I have 2 zeros here, but because of my decimal point, I'm actually going to take one of the zeros off because that's 6/10. 6 times 2 is 12. So instead of 1,200, it will be 120. And when I add 120 plus 6,400, or 6,400, I'm going to get 6,520. And as you can see, if you look back up, that is the same answer that we had when we just multiplied with 32 and 6/10 all together. So if you separate them, it might make it easier to do the math, just more mentally, and then you can combine your numbers. Example 2, introduction to partial products. Use partial products and the distributive property to calculate the area of the rectangular patio shown below. Again, here's the same values that we had like on the second problem above. So I'm going to have 500 multiplied by 22, and I'm also going to have 500 multiplied by 12 hundredths. So again, I'm taking this number and I'm separating it. And so if I add my two zeros from the 500, 5 times 2 is 10, carry the 1. 5 times 2 is 10, but then it would be 11 if you add that 1. And then this number, 5 times 12 is 60. But because of the 2 decimal places, it kind of negates the 2 decimal places at the end, the 2 zeros there. So it's just going to be 11,060. And it would be, if it's area, we would have squared feet. Please remember to do your reflection by writing a comment or a question on the left-hand side of your notes. Also rate yourself if you're green, yellow, or red, so you'll be writing when you come into class tomorrow. If you're able to, provide your own example and a model of the answer.